The wind came first, before the man did, a hot, dry Wyoming wind that rattled through the broken fence posts of the Miller Ranch like it was trying to wake the land from a long sleep. Jonah Carter stood at the edge of the property with a duffel bag over his shoulder and a folded deed in his pocket, looking at what $30,000 of his life savings had bought him: a collapsing barn, a farmhouse with a caved-in porch, and 400 acres of land nobody else wanted. He was 34 years old, and this was his second chance. If you've ever felt like you were starting completely over, with nothing but a little hope and a lot of doubt, stay with this one, because Jonah's story is about to remind you why some people never stop believing in fresh starts, and maybe it'll remind you not to give up on yours either. Jonah had spent 12 years working other men's land, breaking other men's horses, building other men's dreams, while his own sat folded up somewhere in the back of his mind like a letter he never had the courage to open. When the Miller Ranch went up for auction after Old Man Miller passed with no heirs willing to take it, Jonah didn't think twice. He emptied his savings account, packed his truck, and drove 300 miles to a piece of dirt that everyone in town called cursed. They weren't entirely wrong to call it that. The soil was hard, the well was dry more often than not, and the previous 3 owners before Miller had all lost the place to debt. But Jonah didn't believe in curses. He believed in work. So he got up before sunrise every day, patched what could be patched, and started clearing land that hadn't seen a plow in a decade. He talked to no one. He needed no one. That was the story he told himself. Anyway, until the morning a chestnut mare came thundering across his eastern pasture with a rider who had absolutely no business being there. She sat the horse like she'd been born on it, dark hair streaming out from under a hat too fine for ranch work, and when she reined up in front of him, her eyes were sharp with something between curiosity and defiance. "You're the one who bought Miller's place," she said. It wasn't a question. Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "That means something to you." She swung down off the horse in one smooth motion. "My father is Everett Reyes. He owns the Circle R, everything east of that ridge you're standing on. He wanted this land for 15 years. You just made an enemy without even trying." Her name was Sophia Reyes, and she said it like a warning, though Jonah would later learn it was closer to an apology. Sophia had been raised on money, real money, the kind that bought private schools and imported horses and a father's approval only when she performed exactly as expected. But underneath the polish, she rode like someone chasing something she couldn't name. And that morning, watching a stranger stand alone on a broken ranch with nothing but stubbornness holding the fences together, something in her cracked open just slightly. She told herself she came back the second time only to see if the fool had given up yet. She came back a third time to bring him a jar of her housekeeper's peach preserves, claiming she simply had extra. By the 5th visit, neither of them bothered pretending anymore. Word travels fast in small towns, and it wasn't long before Everett Reyes heard that his daughter had been spending her afternoons at the ranch he'd wanted for himself for over a decade. He arrived one evening in a truck that cost more than Jonah's entire property, stepping out in boots that had never touched actual mud. "I'll give you double what you paid," Everett said, without so much as a greeting. "Cash, by Friday." Jonah looked at the man, then passed him toward the barn he'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding with his own hands. Board by board, nail by nail. "It's not for sale." Everett's jaw tightened. "Everything's for sale, son. You just haven't named your price." But Jonah had learned something in those months alone on that land. Some things you don't measure in dollars. And this ranch, cursed or not, had become the first thing in his life that was truly his. The real trouble started when the bank came calling. Jonah had underestimated the cost of repairing an irrigation system that hadn't worked in years, and a payment he'd counted on from a cattle sale fell through when the buyer backed out at the last minute. He was 3 weeks from losing everything, and pride kept him from telling anyone, especially Sophia, who by then had started arriving not with preserves but with her sleeves rolled up, ready to work fence line beside him like she'd been doing manual labor her whole life instead of attending galas. She noticed the letters from the bank stacking up unopened on his kitchen table before he ever said a word. Now here's where the story takes a turn nobody in town saw coming. And if this kind of quiet, stubborn courage means something to you, this is exactly the moment worth sticking around for. Because what Sophia did next changed everything. She went to her father, not to ask for money, but to finally say the thing she'd swallowed her whole life, that she was tired of a love that came with conditions. Tired of a father who measured worth in acreage and bank balances. Tired of watching him try to crush anyone who didn't bow to him. Everett Reyes, for all his hardness, had one soft place left in him. Buried under years of grief, he never spoke of the memory of his late wife, Sophia's mother, who had married him back when he was nothing but a ranch hand with borrowed boots and a stubborn dream not so different from Jonah's. Sophia reminded him of that. She reminded him of the man he used to be before money taught him to forget. Everett didn't apologize. Not in words, men like him rarely did, but 3 days later, an envelope arrived at Jonah's door with no note, only enough cash to cover the bank payment and a scrawled line at the bottom of the receipt: "Consider it rent." For 15 years of wanting something that was never mine to take, Jonah stood on his half-rebuilt porch holding that envelope for a long time. feeling something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen. Finally, by a man who had every reason to resent him. That autumn, the ranch turned a corner. Nobody, not even Jonah, thought it could. The irrigation system held, the herd grew healthy. The barn stood tall and solid against the wind that had once threatened to take everything. And on a cool October evening, with the sky bleeding orange over the ridge that separated the circular from what folks had started calling the Carter place, Jonah found Sophia sitting on the fence they'd rebuilt together, boots dusty, hands calloused in a way her father's guests back home would have found scandalous and beautiful all at once. "You know," she said, not looking at him, "when I rode out here that first day, I told myself I was just being nosy, curious about the fool who bought a cursed ranch." Jonah leaned against the fence beside her, and now, she finally turned to him, and there wasn't a trace of the guarded girl from that first morning left in her eyes. "Now I think maybe this ranch was never cursed at all. I think it was just waiting for someone patient enough to love it back to life." Jonah didn't have a fancy speech in him. He never had, so he simply reached over and took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm, and they sat there together as the sun dropped behind land that had once belonged to no one, and now, somehow, belonged to both of them. Word around town changed too, the way it does when people watch a story unfold with their own eyes. The cursed Miller place became the ranch, where a stubborn cowboy and a rancher's daughter proved that inheritance isn't the only way to build something worth having. Everett Reyes, gruff as ever, started showing up some Sundays to help mend fence, grumbling the whole time about how Jonah still had a lot to learn, though everyone could see the quiet pride in the old man's eyes when he watched his daughter laugh freely for the first time in years. Some folks said it was fate that brought Sophia riding across that pasture the very week Jonah arrived. Others said it was simply two people, each carrying their own kind of loneliness, who happened to find each other on a piece of land that needed exactly what they both had to give. Jonah never did figure out if he believed in fate, but he believed in showing up every morning before the sun, in fixing what was broken instead of walking away from it, and in loving something enough to fight for it even when the whole world told him it wasn't worth saving. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in the dust of that old ranch, that the things worth having are rarely handed to us whole. They're built, slow and stubborn, out of showing up when it would be easier not to. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that second chances are real and that quiet kindness can rebuild even the most broken places, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like Jonah and Sophia's waiting to be told, and somewhere out there, someone needs to hear this one today. Until next time, keep believing in your own fresh start.